Welcome to podcast number 10 of Machine Civilization. I realized there was a delay last week for my normal Friday posts. However, it was an odd combination of various real-life day job issues and a couple of minor, non-threatening family issues. But it allowed me to take notes, not just for this podcast, but for the following week as well. So let's get started. As always, I am your host, Clayton Barnett. When I was very young, it was said that in polite society, there are three things you just didn't talk about: politics, religion, and sex. Now, when I was older, I came to understand that those were the three most interesting things in the world. Why would you avoid them? Having covered politics for a couple of these podcasts, I decided to turn my attention to the other two once taboo subjects, which of course now you simply can't get away from in Western mass media, but it needs to be addressed. So for today, we're going to be talking about sex in machine civilization. As all my podcasts have spoiler warnings, this is going to be a double plus spoiler warning, because I can't talk about the relationships of the characters without discussing the characters themselves and the affairs, so to speak, they have with human to human, demi-human to human, machine to human, machine to demi-human. So if you don't want to have huge swaths of my story ruined for you, please stop now and move on. Otherwise, here we go. Just as I did a few podcasts back when discussing the machines themselves, I'm going to make a similar distinction here, that when I talk about machines, and there's even going to be an additional category at the end, in machine civilization that means three different things, with, of course, overlap. There's always an exception to the rule. But in my future history, the groups are, of course, the AIs that exist, by and large, as pure code. There are androids, some of which are standalone sentient machines, some of which are used to house part of the consciousness of one of the AIs. There are, for one book so far, the Sense, a human body with a quantum computer mind placed into its skull, along with some religious overtones to place an artificial soul and animate the body as well. And then, while not technically a machine, it's germane to the discussion of sex, so I'm also going to discuss what are called demi-humans. These are humans such as Faustina and her brother Gary, who, both in the womb and then later Faustina continued to modify herself, has had their neurosystems changed. So they think very fast, they think very differently, and that's also proven true for some of Faustina's children in the books that I'm writing now. And then a sub-category of demi-humans, even though I lump her in there with everyone else, would of course be Henge, because she was not made from another human. She was made essentially from nanomaterials and star stuff, byproduct of a fusion reaction's equipotential flux point. But I lump her in there together, and she'll be part of the discussion. Starting with AIs, pure code. How exactly would pure code have sex? Well, I don't think they do. There are a couple of instances where, in order to make it accessible to a reader, the AIs have made what they call constructs, where, I guess to borrow from that movie 25 years ago or so, The Matrix, where the human mind can be briefly stolen by the machines in certain Wi-Fi areas, and their consciousness brought to these temporary artificial areas that they've made. Sometimes it looks like a rocky desert. Henge made one that looks like a beach, probably down on the Gulf Coast. And I know there, in their virtual bodies and with the human virtual consciousness there, for example, at one point, the diplomat from the Habsburg Empire, our Rodrigo, was brought over and briefly observed young teen Henge making out with her boyfriend, 13-year-old Gary Hartman. on the beach, and they still have their swimsuits on and all, because they're both good young Catholics, although, as he put it, as quoting him, I begin to understand his attraction to this electronic person, because if they can go all the way here, then why not? Because, I mean, they left hickeys on each other. At one point, he had his hand up under her bathing suit top, and then she noticed the fact that a human was watching them, and immediately they went into business and started talking dialogue. So in the virtual environment, I am convinced that the AIs can have basically simulated sex with both each other and with a human, if so desired. A odd little subpoint of that is early on in my very first novel, when Lily Barrett is first brought to the very first construct of the machines. And after she walks there, I use the term small d doctrine of co-creation from the Catholic Church, is that anything she came in contact with changed. The next time she was brought over, instead of just a rocky desert, there was sawgrass. The next time, there were plants and trees. And it bothered the eldest of the machines, Dad, very badly, because he does not like change. And this human introduced uncontrollable change into his construct. It's interesting is that had he chosen, he could have just shut it down or rebooted it and started over. But he didn't. He was curious enough that even though he disliked intensely what had happened to his construct, he wanted to know where it was going. And then almost toward the end of that first book, The Fourth Law, is he did something extremely surprising. He somehow used the changed code, which was a part of the co-created landscape that he had made from Lily Barrett's co-creation. And he used that change code and integrated that with a part of his own, and I simply used the term, he created his daughter, Henge. So, in a way, that's sexual related, because he didn't make a copy of himself. This wasn't like a flower that was budding or something like that. But he used outside influence and his own nature to create a new thinking machine. Yes, it's a little unusual, but that's the things I write. When it comes to androids, it depends on how they're built. One of the earliest, if you look at stories in a timeline, one of the earliest things that happened, probably in a timeline situation, the first book would be Crosses and Double Crosses, and the second book would be Friend and Ally. So at the start of Friend and Ally, as the U.S. is falling apart, and as the final touches are being put on Nicole 5 Clark, who is a machine, and as a Model 5, she is designed to function seamlessly in human society, and that's up to and including sexual relations. So, a couple of times in the book, she kisses various guys. At one point when she was packing, one of her boyfriends, who knows what she is at this point, looks at her bed and notices a tube labeled artificial saliva, and for just a second he recalled what she is, a made thing, and he just, oh my god. But he's hopelessly in love with her, so people can get over that. But at one point, while she's recharging in one of the dams along the Columbia River, talking with her boyfriend, Gil, that he was asking about her family, and she actually went off on this tangent, saying, why, yes, because I'm a Model 5, I can have sexual intercourse. Of course, I'll need to inject an internal lubricant, and he cuts her off, saying, that's not what I was talking about. That's not where we were. How did you go off on that tangent? And then she apologizes, and however, that allowed me to inform the reader that, yes, she can have physical relationships with a human being. In a chronological timeline later, even though it's my first book, when the android form of I, her best friend, shows up in Waxahachie, Texas, at one point on a throwaway line, I's android says, yes, this body is fully functional after all. I don't know if that means she's capable of sexual intercourse, but considering that physical design would have happened 4 years after Nicole 5 was constructed, I don't see why not. I mean, anytime you're adding a module to a unit, you're going to be adding cost. So would I have wanted a body that looks like her to have that ability? Maybe. I don't know. Her statement was ambiguous, so I can't really say one way or the other. Some other androids, for example, the body which houses a slice of Fausta's consciousness. Fausta is the most aggressive of Tribe Tosca, of the AIs, and considers herself a warrior. And when she first meets Lily Barrett at the start of Echoes of Family Lost, my second book, and she had ridden up on her motorcycle she had purchased when she got off the boat in Houston and drove up to Waxahachie, and strips down in Lily's apartment and asks for a rag to wipe herself down with. Lily notes immediately that from her neck down to just below her elbows, down to just below her knees, she's covered in black scales. Basically, it's scale armor made out of composite material. And as a result of that, everything outside that I just mentioned was covered. So no, she is manifestly, that body is incapable of any physical sexual relationships at all. I mean, I suppose she could kiss somebody or potentially give them a blowjob, I don't know. But otherwise, no, that's an example of a form that expressly was not designed for that capability. The next, which I'll just dwell on briefly because it's an easy one to cover, is the sense. Since that is a human body with the original brain taken out, burned up, and then replaced with a quantum computer, of course they can have sex. In fact, Christopher Deno, who's the protagonist of the story, and his step-cousin in San Diego, Katarina Sosabowski, have quite a bit. This was, after all, my romance horror novel, and so the sex they have, it's the only time I've ever written anything very explicit. And no, I didn't have to go look it up online. Yes, I realize I'm middle-aged and have an engineering background, but, you know, my wife has stuck around 30 years for a reason, so I'm not a complete ignoramus. And also, the antagonist, Chris's quote-unquote sister, Maya, we know that she has to, in order to get free passes on a ship from Hokkaido to Vancouver, BC, every other day has to give a blowjob to one of the ship ratings, Tenaktua, before he meets a very unpleasant, untimely end. And I would imagine that having the body of a late-teen girl, the rest of her is just as functional as well. Demis, as I mentioned earlier, are human. They have a modified neurosystem, and we're going to put Henge off in her own category for just a little bit, but she's physically, basically human as well. But a lot of her, not just neuromuscular, but her muscular skeletal system is also much more robust than humans as well. After all, she's made from nanomaterials as opposed to built together like flesh as we are in a womb. But otherwise, for the demi-humans, it's just their nervous system and their brain that's slightly modified. Their bodies are otherwise completely unremarkable from that of a normal human being. That is very pointedly demonstrated to little 10-year-old Faustina in Worlds Without End as she goes on 12-mile hikes and runs with her father and brother, because especially her father, who's a military man, doesn't want her arrogance about how she thinks to spill over in how she acts. And he wasn't thinking about sex. He was thinking she already has this bend toward combat. He doesn't want her to do something stupid and put herself into a position where I thought myself into this, I'm sure I can physically fight my way out. And he shows decisively that, no, you've got the body of a young girl, and then later you're going to have the body of a young woman, and every single guy you come up against, especially if they're in the army, is going to be able to knock you down with one punch. So yeah, you think you're as arrogant as hell. You think better than we do, but don't ever think that your body is as good as a male human body, because it's not. She takes that to heart and focuses, she keeps herself in shape, certainly, but she focuses instead on combat training, on leadership, on logistics, on leading an army instead of fighting in the front ranks. And that's what we see when she's 18 and 19 in the 3 books of the American Imperium trilogy. The outlier of that, of course, is Henge, and on a couple of occasions I mention she and her husband, Gary, having sex, but I don't dwell on it because outside of Cursed Hearts, these are not hypersexualized stories. I just try to draw the curtain and say, but because they're both demi-humans, they can completely open their minds to each other. So I place in Henge's mouth at one point the words, when they're lying together, working on a brother for their first daughter, that Henge says this